Manawa mai te Māori nuku, manawa mai te Māori rangi. Ko te Māori, ki au, he Māori tipua, ka pākaru mai te pau. Humie, huie, tai kia. Kia ora koutou, everybody. My name is Cara Skelly-Irvine, and I'm presenting this webinar about making sense of impact on behalf of iPEN. Who is iPEN, you may ask? Some of you will know and some of you won't. So iPEN stands for the Impact Planning and Evaluation Network. iPEN actually started way back in 2014, and the focus for iPEN has always been around turbocharging impact across all 7 CRIs. When it very first started back in 2014, it was much more of an informal network of colleagues. So right from the beginning, there was a recognition that bringing representatives who are interested in impact from across all 7 CRIs was going to be most useful. But initially it started as a more informal collegial networking, exchanging of information and ideas and so on. And then in 2019, it turned into a more formal program of work with the development of the trainings and some special project work that we've done. But it has always been around building and sharing collaboratively developed resources and tools that are going to be useful for everyone, because there's a recognition that, of course, raising everyone's capability is going to serve everyone's interests who's operating in this system. And iPEN's work, if you're not aware, actually won an international award last year around the whole system of work that's been developed, which the team is very proud of. The other thing that it's, I think, really important to let you know, and we always continue to try and remind ourselves, is everyone in the system is extremely busy. So we do try and always apply the KISS principle. They're trying to keep it simple. And a lot of the concepts that apply when we're thinking about impact, it's not rocket science. A lot of it is common sense, but as many of you have probably experienced, common sense and just the application of what are some fairly simple but logical sort of ideas sometimes doesn't feel quite right. Sometimes it might be like, surely there must be more to it than this. So we focus a lot on trying to show people how they can keep using a fairly core, simple set of tools and keep using them to support them and their work to be as impactful as possible. You'll see just on the side there, there's myself and also Chanel, who many of you may have corresponded with, who is our admin support. And my role, both Chanel and I, are independent of any of the CRIs. We work for the network as a whole. Okay, impact. What are we talking about? Impact fundamentally is trying to understand what difference are we making. And not only that, often our focus on impact is not only what's the difference we're making, but we're often wanting to understand that so that we can also ask a more reflective question about, okay, and now how could we do it better? What we have learned from iPEN's actually a fairly substantial piece of work we did right at the start of the development of all of the capability building was actually just trying to understand what was the baseline understanding and needs at that time. And what we heard, and it was very clear, that everyone was very motivated about trying to deliver impact, but the how has always been one of the things that people have struggled with. And so that was helpful for us because we were then able to focus a lot more on the how. So what are we going to be covering in the session? So first of all, I'm going to take you a little bit of a history lesson and just walking you through a little bit slowly about some of the key concepts that we'll see in that we see in the system. So I'm going to talk you through the origins of the concept of impact. Then we're going to talk about the definition of it in the New Zealand science system. Why is it important? Why would we bother thinking about it? And then getting into the how piece. And that's where, when I said we'd just take a wee bit of time to walk you through a few things, there's some key concepts and terminology that once you've got to grips with your sort of 5 steps into your journey around how do you actually try and think and structure and plan for impact. As I said before, what does it look like? So that's when we'll hear from MS, just talking through an example from his work. And then what next? So just to let you know what's on the cards for iPEN at the moment. Okay, so where has the idea of impact originated? One of the first things I think a lot of us know intrinsically is that it's a word, it's been in the English language for a long time. It's not a new thing, it's not a new concept. And it's one of those things that if you start to tune in, you will hear people on the news talking about impact. It's a word and a phrase that is used in many different contexts for broadly the same things. But of course, context is quite important. And okay, so what does it mean in our context? In terms of it being used in a sort of a more specific way about making a difference from things that are funded by government usually, sort of its origins can actually be traced back to a very strong focus from the international development and the charitable sector, where that has been a focus for some decades. So if any of you have taken an interest in sort of international politics, geopolitics, you'll know that sort of especially in the 60s, but really post-World War II, there started to be a really big focus on international development. That was when the UN was established. And so a lot of countries providing quite substantial amounts of money to lift various countries up and out of poverty. And in doing so, obviously people who were investing their money or not investing, depending on which of those big multilateral agencies you were, people wanted to make sure that money was actually making a difference. So when we start to look at the origins of the concept and the ways that we think about impact and the tools that we use, a lot of the tools and the jargon can be, if you go and have a look at OECD and the World Bank, you'll see a lot of the frameworks have the origins there. Then more recently, we're talking about the last 2 or 3 decades where we've had the concept of performance management or performance reporting, which is often referred to as the new public management, which in New Zealand, that was when a lot of those reforms came in the 90s, where there was a much stronger focus on performance rather than just the production of things and stuff. And so that is where we started to hear the phrases results-based management. Results is just another word for outcomes and impacts. So the concept has been around for quite some time at a macro scale and even at government level. And more recently, and I would reflect and say that's probably been in the last 10 years, 10 to 15, for me, I'd say probably about the last 10, it's been incorporated a lot more into both the public sector, but now a lot of private sector stuff. A lot of us will have heard about social impact, the concept of social impact investing, social enterprise, all of those sorts of things where people are using the word impact to talk about wanting to make a difference that's not just about money. In general terms, I think we all know what we get the gist of it, but it still feels quite hard to grasp. It still feels quite amorphous as a concept. In general, what does impact mean? Impact is about change. That is about the difference that you're making. Now, when we're thinking about change, that's still quite a large kind of concept to try and grasp. Typically, impact is clustered into some themes or some domain areas. That is often, not always, things like culture, environment, society, and economy. For any of you who might be familiar with the term triple bottom line, that was 3 of these 4 domains. So these are all just types of impact. They're just categories. But an important thing to recognize is impact isn't a thing, it's a human construct. Impact is a human construct. It's something that we care about. It's defined by people. It reflects our values, okay? So it's not something that exists separate from us. So don't forget that, because what that means is that impact doesn't have a universal definition. It means that what impact might mean in a particular context may change because of what is important, what's valued, what's important in that context. Impact has magnitude, it has size. We want lots of impact, or we've had a little bit of an impact, and it also has relative importance. So that relative importance is all about what's valued in a particular context. For example, in some contexts, we are going to care more about economic impact and less about possibly social impact or environmental impact. And in other contexts, those dials are going to be switched and shifted, okay? The other thing to know is that there is no standard or strict definition of impact. And so that's where I think a lot of people's confusion comes from. So hopefully just knowing this is going to help you feel a little less confused if you're one of those people, and you would be one of many. And the other thing to just really confuse everything is there are lots of other words that are commonly used to mean the same thing. So you might hear people talk about impact, but you might also hear people talk about results or outcomes or benefits. And broadly speaking, they all mean much the same thing, which is about the change, the difference that you are making or have made. What does it mean in the New Zealand RSNI system? This is where we go to MBIE. MBIE is the steward of our system, and they have developed a definition for the science system, which is drawn from OECD definition. So the way that MBIE has defined this is impact from research is the change to the economy, society, or environment beyond contributions to knowledge and skills in the research organisation. So it's not about the gains that have been made within your institution. If you're a researcher, it's about the changes that you have contributed to as a result of your work out there. Oh, now just very quickly, we'll be sharing copies of these slides and links to a bunch of these resources. Obviously, feel free to take notes, but you'll get a copy of the slides after this. So just to show how the definition of impact is context specific, it's also helpful to see another research organisation here in New Zealand, our funder, the Health Research Council. So they have a similar definition. You can see how it's also rooted in OECD, which is about change, indirect, both positive and negative. So here HRC talk about the direct and indirect influence of excellent research on individuals, communities, or society as a whole, including improvements to health and equity and other social, economic, cultural, or environmental benefits. So you can see there they've actually expanded their definition of impact out a bit, and they've flagged or highlighted some areas that are of particular interest to them in the health sector. So obviously health we care about, there's a few different levels there. We care about individuals' health, but also communities and societies' health. And also here you'll see a focus on equity, because we know that's an important focus in our health system. So in addition to this, impact is also, impact's an important, it sits within a Te Ao Māori worldview as well. So if we're trying to consider impact and in a Māori worldview, what that is really about is seeking to understand. So it's about understanding what that perspective might be and what that might look like for your particular context. And of course, the way to do that is to go and have conversations with those representatives, the iwi or whatever's appropriate in your context, and discussing and finding out what is the impact that can be created by and with Māori through your partnerships and work with them. The other key thing is, and a reminder, and I think many of us know this, but it's always good to be reminded, this needs to be thought about right from the start or as early as possible, because how you define impact is you need to be thinking about that right from the very beginning while you're developing the ideas, the research ideas. And this, in considering what impact might look like for Māori in your context, is important because it's applicable to all of us and often just expressed in slightly different ways, which reflects a Te Ao Māori perspective. So from an iPEN's perspective, we're working with predominantly TAP to support the discussions around this in future. But we also just want to point you to a few useful resources. Vision Mātauranga, which you'll obviously, I'm sure most of you will be aware of. That's our kind of core reference document for the system. But if you're not aware, there is also this really great resource, which I encourage you to read. It's really helpful. A guide to Vision Mātauranga, lessons from Māori voices in the New Zealand science sector. And we've got a link to that. The other thing, it's a bit of a watch this space at the moment, obviously. We do have a strategy announcements that's been made around a position with working with Māori, but we're all still in a bit of a wait and see game with what's going on with the new minister. But what we do know is that previously, the draft Research, Science and Innovation Strategy did have a stronger focus towards supporting Vision Mātauranga. That has been overtaken by Future Pathways work. And of course, we are looking forward to hearing from Nick to see what's next for that. Okay, so finally, the other thing to remember when we're thinking about impact in New Zealand is go and have a look at Treasury's Living Standards Framework and also Hiara Wairoa. So these are other ways, other frameworks that you might like to go and look at when you're starting to try and think about what might impact mean or look like for you, for your context. Okay, so that's a big picture for impact. But now if we start to translate that concept to you and your work as a researcher or as someone who supports research or maybe funds and commissions research, the key thing to remember is that research doesn't deliver impact, actually. Research is a contributor. Impact, by definition, is something that you can only ever make a contribution to. And of course, I think we all know this intrinsically, but it often gets forgotten about. There are many other factors that you don't have control over that are going to make a difference, contribute to how much impact happens. So impact is something that you are seeking to influence, but you can't control. So remember that impact is a collective endeavour. So this is a slide that I hope you remember, or if you're trying to remember, come back to this slide to say, where do I fit in this impact story? You want to be a contributor. We all want to contribute as much as possible, but remember, we are influencing, not controlling, and it's a collective endeavour. So to explain this concept a bit more, we're actually going to use an example from international development. And the reason why we're using this is because there's some really good videos online about this. It is completely agnostic of our system. It's something that we can all understand. And so we want to make this as accessible as possible as we start out unpacking all of this. And if you want to go and watch more, you can click on the links here and find out more about the origins of this story. So before we start to unpack it, we need to have some tools to understand what the heck is the impact from fish soup. So the tools that we're using, a couple of things. It's one thing, but it can look like a few different things. This is the results chain framework. This is from MBIE's position paper on impact research. And so what you can see here is that it's a logical sequence of events: inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, impacts. And so you can see they're using the results chain framework, but this is often described as a few other different things. Here you can see this is a very similar depiction of this results chain: inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, impacts. This is taken from HRC's guidance. What you can see there is they've shown how that's connected at all stages in the process to building the knowledge base and connecting out to the next and end users of research. But what these are often called is not results chains all the time. They can be called all sorts of things. Just want to give you a language alert that if you've heard things like the logic model, intervention logic, program logic, anything like that, it's all this, okay? It's all logically unpacking and describing what are the inputs, what are the activities, the outputs, the outcomes, the impacts. So this is our tool. The other thing you're going to see is I'm flipping the orientation. So that's just another little hot tip. Don't get too worried if the orientation is different. Yeah, that's irrelevant. It's more of a stylistic thing, or the landscape and the real estate on the page that you're trying to grab. So using this tool and applying it to the fish soup story, here's the super simple example and explanation of what all of this language means and how we think about and understand what contribution we might be having to impact. So everything starts with usually a problem. Sometimes it's an opportunity, but typically we're starting from that problem space. And in this instance, my challenge is that I'm a parent, I've got kids, I want them to eat healthy food, and it needs to be food that they like so that they will eat it, because I want them to be healthy and grow up to be functional human beings. So what I need to do is I need to figure out what's a food that they love to eat. What's some of the things? The first things we do is we get the stuff together, the ingredients, and then the things that we need to cook the soup. Then we do some things, mother or father, it could be an auntie, whoever, carefully prepare and cook all the ingredients. That results in a soup that's tasty and it's healthy. It's not just any old soup. It's got some quality descriptors there. It's tasty and it's healthy. And the kids eat it, and they taste it and they eat it and they go, oh, yum, this is nice. Can we have this every Monday night? And as a result of that, the kids grow up healthy and strong. So here you can see that the organisation is from bottom to top. And if you haven't guessed already, these are your inputs, the things like the Lego bricks, if you like. These are the things that we do, the activities. The output is the thing that is produced. And we usually, outputs aren't just the thing. Outputs often have some qualitative description. So is it a good quality one? So in this case, that's around taste and it's health, it's healthiness, it's nutritional value. And then we start to move into the change space, the outcomes. So that's about the kids have had it and they've gone, oh, yes, please, I would like that. And then the longer term change that we're hoping to influence is kids growing up healthy. So what you can see is there's quite a clear line here that differentiates what is within our control as parents, where we can attribute what goes on under this line is very much in our control. So that's very much what we are doing, we can control, and therefore how well we've done, our performance can be linked back to those. But as soon as we move above the line, that are things that we can only influence. So that's the area that we're contributing to. And it goes from strong to weak. So we've got more chance to influence these outcomes, shorter term outcomes, than we do to influence longer term outcomes and impacts. So for example, my daughter decides that she wants to be a vegetarian, and that's because of decisions that she has made from what she's read or her friends. And so I can't control that. I might seek to influence it, but that might be fixed in stone, in which case I'm going to have to go back and I'm going to have to figure out a different, maybe it's a tofu soup instead. So translating all of this into a science context really quickly, as a quick example, in our case, usually the opportunity or the problem is something that has come from our next door end users. Not always. If we were more in that blue skies area, the ideas can come from all sorts of directions, but for simplicity's sake, this is how it often comes. And so the solution is that we're going to develop some kind of research or science solution to address this opportunity or capitalize on this opportunity, or to address the challenge, the problem. The sorts of inputs that we would typically have is like a research team that's got the right skills, obviously, not just any old research team. We need to have a clear definition of the problem or the opportunity. We need money, we need equipment, we need to have the right methods and infrastructure to tackle it. Activities that we would typically do are might be doing experiments, it's the analysis, drafting up the results, all of those sorts of things, and things like project management is also important for this to actually happen. Our outputs would be things like papers, it might be a product or a service. It also might be things like the conference presentations that you do, and can also include some softer outputs around things like discussions with stakeholders or the next and end users about where you've got to and what next. And then when we move into outcomes, there's this area where we're seeking to influence, but we can't control. What we're hoping is that as a result of us doing a really great job down here, stakeholders or the next end users are going to use or apply or adopt our outputs, and that's going to result in a change that we all wanted to see. And it can also feed back by improving the knowledge base around the problem of interest or that's important, which is going to help feed into that next round of research, so it's better defined or better focused in future. So if you think back to the HRC diagram and those plugs, the plugging back into the knowledge base, that's where that loop comes back. And then obviously the long-term impacts that we're hoping to contribute to are things like stakeholder or next and end users' lives or their jobs or whatever is relevant to the context for the research are improved in ways that are important or valued to them. Again, that reminder about where we can control, so we can control down here and we're seeking to influence up here. Now, just to let you know, there's some really good guidance, not only in the MBIE's paper, but HRC has some really great guidance around this as well. So I'd really encourage you to read it, and we've got the links to all of that, so you can go and read that at your leisure later. Now, I also just hinted before at the fact that there are feedback loops at all of these stages, and the diagram from HRC highlights that. This is a diagram, so it is a simplification of the process, but to acknowledge that there are feedback loops all the time. And particularly when we're talking about bits of research that are rolling over multiple periods, we've often got almost like micro runs of this where we make a bit of progress and it feeds back into, oh, we need to do this next thing or do this additional activity and create this extra output, just to acknowledge that. So just to show an example this is a simplified example from Manaaki Whenua around possum control, what that might look like. So in this case, the practical problem was that they needed a more effective and humane way to trap and kill possums. So they wanted to continue trapping, their stakeholders wanted to continue trapping, but there were some concerns about how effective and how humane it was, so they needed to develop. The solution was they needed to develop a new trap that was acceptable for use by DOC, their stakeholder in this case. So they got all of those standard inputs together. The activities that they did in this case was they built the possum trap, they tested it, they did things like engaged with DOC to make sure that as they were developing this trap, it was actually going to be workable for DOC, did things like project management to make sure it was on track and on budget and all of that. And so as a result, they developed a trap. They also developed guidelines on how to use it. So these are all some of the different types of outputs that you might have. Research publications, of course, conference presentations, and then there would also have been some of the things like maybe some training with DOC about how to use them, all those sorts of things. And then here's the change space, the impact space that we're talking about. The change that they were hoping to contribute to from their work was that DOC adopted the trap in their practices and as part of their SOPs, their standard operating procedures. And so as a result of that, more possums are killed in more humane ways. And so that gives DOC social license to continue to operate. As a result of all of that, the long-term impacts of things like better protected and healthier New Zealand native flora and fauna and all of the benefits that come from that, like that might be the intrinsic value that we get if we're a conservationist or a nature lover. So where are we talking about? Where does the impact come? The impact comes in those top two areas. So it's the outcomes and the impacts. And so that's possibly one thing that's really helpful to remember, that when we're talking about impacts, actually what we're talking about is outcomes first. Achieving those outcomes, those shorter and medium term outcomes, because through achieving those or making a strong contribution to those, then the logic dictates that you're much more likely to have a strong influence on achieving those longer term impacts. Okay, so why would we bother thinking about all of this? We know, as I said earlier, that if we're in the science and research game, we are actually motivated fundamentally about having a contribution, making a difference in some way that's important to you in your area. You also know it's public and industry money, so there's a duty to spend the investment well. And we know that we want to build trust and credibility and enthusiasm and support for science and research. And that's been quite polarised in both directions as a result of COVID, where science and research was out there a lot. And of course, it does help you get more funding. If you can more clearly articulate the contributions, the difference that your research has made or will make, then you're going to make a much more convincing argument for funding. And of course, making a difference is a key driver for us. Okay, next slide, one that I really want you to remember. Okay, so first one is about research as a contributor to impact. This is the next one. This is what you need to focus on. How you actually have an impact is about your process. Focus on what you do, the process that you do to plan and deliver your science. So achieving impact is about how you plan and deliver it. And so that is about systematically thinking about it from the start right to the very end. By doing that is how you will maximize the chances that you're going to have a bigger impact, have the greatest contribution. And so that's about gathering and evidencing the difference that you're making to tell a plausible story around your contribution. So how we can actually evidence it is going to be quite dependent on your context. So one of the things that is a bit of a killer sometimes is to find out that there isn't some magic metric to tell you what your impact is. Your impact is going to be best evidenced by the measures that are appropriate for the type of research that you're doing and the types of outcomes and impacts that you are wanting to make a contribution to. And the other thing too to remember is that we're talking about a plausible story. So when we're talking about evidence here, the weight of evidence is often different to what we might be expected to pull together for a research publication, for example. So not often that you have people talking about impact associated with p-values. It's much more around the weight of evidence. And so that's where I find the idea of how we make decisions in court is actually a more helpful analogy to remember, that it's about the plausibility rather than a p-value. So in terms of the process, what you want to do is this iterative cycle, okay? It's about how you plan, about how you do it, how you and then how you look at what's happening and then reflect on that and then make updates to your change. So it's an iterative process. So this is a diagram and a really great video that we'd love for you to go and watch from Beyond Results. Beyond Results was a program of work funded through SIF from Ag Research, and so a lot of iPEN's work has built off the Beyond Results tools and templates. So if you come along to any of the training, you'll see Beyond Results popping up some more. Now, there's a really great video that summarizes why we actually want to focus on impact and tells a little bit of the story behind Beyond Results here. And so this is one that we've got a link to, and we would really encourage you to watch. It's about 2 minutes of your time. So after the session, if you're going to go and grab some lunch, sit down and watch this, and it will fill in a little bit more of the story for you. So finally, to answer the question around, is this our job? Yes. Sometimes it's very tempting to just say, I just want to focus on this. That's how I came into this whole area. We do need to be thinking about impact in a more systematic way, much like we have to do other things that contribute to doing really great science and research, like budgeting, project management, stakeholder management, all of those sorts of things. So we can't just wish it to happen, but it does require some specialist skills. So get some guidance, because you're going to need a wee bit of support and assistance. And so that's the gap that iPEN has been seeking to address, along supporting the strategies that each CRI is doing. So if you do want some help, go and get in touch with your iPEN rep, go and have a look on the resources that are on the iPEN website, get in touch with the team, and we can help direct you to what might be appropriate for you. And this is also a key way to realise our own individual motivations as to why we got into this area in the first place. So now we're going to hear from MS, who's going to talk about impact in practice. And he's going to be talking about an example that actually was using a lot of the tools that the team at AgResearch were building through Beyond Results. So that work was actually, they were building tools and resources and then applying them into a bunch of projects. And this was one of them.
Thanks, Kara, for the introduction. As Kara mentioned, I'm MS Srinivasan. I'm a principal scientist at NIWA Christchurch. Recently, I led the MBIE Endeavour program called Irrigation Insight, and I'm going to share a few lessons from that program as how we built impact into that program. The Irrigation Insight program addressed on-farm water use efficiency. In this case, it is on-farm irrigation water use efficiency, as irrigation is the biggest user of water on farm. Irrigations happen for three reasons. First one is a supply-based irrigation, which is called the just-in-case irrigation, where irrigations are triggered based on availability of supply on any given day. The second one is a demand-based irrigation. In this case, farmers measure some kind of a crop or soil water demand in some way. Sometimes they could be modeling the demand and apply irrigations accordingly. In this case, there is an assumption supply is available whenever they want to apply the irrigation. And in the Irrigation Insight program, we added a third dimension to this one. In addition to demand, that is current demand, on-farm demand, you can also look at the upcoming supply for the next 2 to 6 days in terms of rainfall and apply the irrigations accordingly. If there is a rainfall expected in the next 2 to 6 days, then skip the irrigation that has been planned for today. Use that rainfall that is going to be coming on in the next 2 to 6 days as irrigation. We also know worldwide, just-in-time irrigation is not widely used, leave alone the justified irrigation for now. And just in case is widely used, about 80% of the farms use it. Over time, researchers have looked at this problem, why just in case is widely accepted and adapted as opposed to just in time. And they came up with the conclusion the tech transfer approach that is being used to develop tools and implement the tools has not been very successful in actually getting the message across to the farming community. As the tech transfer approaches have been shown to be not working in enabling adoption of efficient irrigation practices on farm, for the Irrigation Insight program, we decided to use a co-innovation approach. A co-innovation approach is a very non-linear approach, and it includes multiple stakeholders, may include more than one direction of movement, as well as it may have outputs that may or may not be tangible, unlike a tech transfer approach. In a tech transfer approach, when we know the irrigations are poorly scheduled, we just move forward and say what kind of tools and methods that we could develop to make the irrigations more efficient, and then develop those tools and push those tools into the farming community. In case of a co-innovation approach, instead of moving forward, we take a step back and sit with the stakeholders and talk to them if they see the same problem as the researchers would see based on the data that they are collecting. Then look at the causes, the drivers and constraints on irrigation practices, why those practices are happening the way that they're happening, and how could they be addressed in a way that is sustainable for all the users in the system. So some of the terms that are included in the irrigation in a co-innovation approach is trust, inclusiveness, shared vision, and shared value, and many of which cannot be measured and can be reported as tangible outputs. So this is a big challenge for a co-innovation approach. Co-innovation being a very new process for us, we decided to take one step at a time. So the first year, we spent time recording ongoing and current irrigation practices and the farmer's perception to irrigation. So in the first year, all we were asking the question is, when do farmers irrigate? What kinds of triggers that they use to start the irrigation? To understand the process of irrigation scheduling, when the farmers start the irrigation and when they stop it, we selected 6 dairy farms in North Canterbury and installed in each one of those farms under one irrigator, a rain gauge, and a soil moisture sensor at 20 centimeter depth. The rain gauge measured rainfall and irrigation, and the soil moisture sensor measured soil temperature and soil moisture at 20 centimeter depth. So we shared this data with the farmers, and we learned two things in that first year. One is farmers use two things. One is the full point. Full point is the time, is the point they stop the irrigation, and any water that you apply beyond that full point is either draining below the root zone or it is running over land downstream. The stress point is where they start the irrigation. Farmers are generally advised to keep the soil moisture within those two red lines between the stress point and full point, and invariably farmers try to stay closer to the full point just in case they don't get the water that they need for irrigation next week, next month, whenever it is that they need. Year two was the start of the co-learning, co-innovation process. We introduced another stakeholder to the challenge. Regional Council joined this stakeholder group along with the researchers and the farmers. And the buzzword for this year is drainage. They're not only talking about irrigation, farmers are talking about irrigation, researchers are talking about water use efficiency and weather forecast, and regulators are talking about drainage. Since regulators were interested in drainage, researchers during that year focused on the drainage. By drainage, we are looking at not only when to start the irrigation, when to stop the irrigation, or irrigation is happening at the wrong times. For example, these case study forms that you see on screen, forms 1 through 5. Form 1 applies about 450 millimeters of irrigation when they're getting about 350 millimeters of rainfall. If you look at Form 5, it receives about 130 millimeters of rainfall less than Form 1, which is about 20 kilometers as crow flies. And they apply about 130 millimeters more irrigation. So they are offsetting the rainfall with irrigation. And if you look at the drainage, Form 5 is draining maybe 10 times more irrigation as drainage compared to Form 1. So there is good and bad thing about this one. Now we know how much drainage is happening, which is good. The bad thing is we are giving this information at the end of the irrigation season, and farmers cannot change the irrigation practices that they have done about 3 months ago now. So year three involved taking the learning from year two and implementing it in a way that the farmers and the regulators can use it. So during year one, we are measuring the soil moisture at 20 centimeter depth. In year three, we decided to measure the soil moisture from zero, from the top, all the way up to 80 centimeter into the soil. And about 40 centimeter or 50 centimeter is the root zone for the pasture that these people are growing. So we said, okay, if I can measure what is happening below that 50 centimeter depth, then I can say any increase in the soil moisture below that 50 centimeter as drainage, and farmers can use that as a trigger to say when they should be stopping the irrigation. So during this season, we installed a soil moisture sensor that can go up to 80 centimeter. Then I told the farmer how to use this one. So simply telling them, look at the soil moisture at 20 centimeter to start an irrigation when the soil is dry, and keep an eye on the soil moisture at 80 centimeter. If the soil moisture goes up when you are irrigating, that means you are draining. And you can see here in this example, the 2 times that they were draining, it is all caused by the rainfall as opposed to the irrigation. So it is all well and good. This is about 6 weeks of data that I'm showing you on screen. The same form for the 6 week that followed the first good 6 week, every irrigation caused a drainage. It is quite interesting. When I talked to the farmer, I didn't stop the farmer from irrigating during this time. One of the objective of the Irrigation Insight program was to develop tools and approaches that farmers can implement by themselves without having a researcher actively involved in the decision-making process. So I didn't say anything when the irrigations were happening during the second half of this season. And when I talked to the farmer after that irrigation season, why they were irrigating at times when they should not have irrigated, soil moisture was up and stuff like that, they said the grass wasn't growing well, so they thought it is struggling for water, so we applied the irrigation. So the default position is whenever they're not growing enough grass, the first thing that they go to is applying more water. So it could be a case of nutrient. In this case, maybe it was a nutrient issue. By irrigating more and draining more and leaching that nutrient that is already available in the soil, actually they're depleting the soil, and the pasture growth obviously was going to go down. So for researchers, the lesson is very clear. There is no point in telling something that farmers can follow or understand and be confident of taking decisions. So we need to make the invisible visible, which is the challenge for the last year. So we took the same soil moisture plot that I showed you in one of the earlier slides, and we converted that into a seamless plot of soil moisture. So what on screen is the soil moisture within the top 80 centimeter of the soil. The cooler the color, the better the soil. And if it is red or hotter the color, it will be dry. So that is what this is saying. It is showing the data for about 2 weeks time. We added on top of that soil moisture plot, the rainfall, irrigation, evaporation plot. So this farmers can see what irrigation that they have been applying and what kind of impact it is having on their soils in terms of soil moisture increasing or decreasing, how the soil is drying between the rainfall events and the irrigation events. Then we added the forecast information on top of it. So you can see anything to the right of the dashed line, the vertical dashed line is the forecast. If there was a rainfall, you would have seen that rainfall on that one. So that forecast also is forecasting and projecting what will be the likely soil moisture condition over the next 6 days if there was no irrigation happening. So now farmers can see in one plot how much rainfall that they are getting, how much irrigation that they are applying, what is their soil doing based on those two things, and how much evaporation is happening, and add the forecast layer on top of it. So here they got all the information in one plot, which the inside plot is quite useful for the farmers to understand what's happening to the soils and the cause and effect of the irrigation and the soil moisture condition. So what I showed you until now, making the invisible visible, is how we contributed to the water use efficiency challenge. Now I want to show you an example of how the factors contribution and the attribution, they come together, how the impact was achieved in this program. So here is an example of a real farm where this irrigation insight plot is being used, soil moisture plot is being used. And this particular farm has got an irrigation hardware limit. They got an irrigator that can apply only 20 to 30 millimeters of water, and they don't have water to apply every day. It has to be done every 8th or 9th day. And they got a reasonably heavy soil, which means they can grow, they can hold the water longer. So now the farmer was asking themselves the question, are they putting too much water and draining the water? And because they are coming back every 8th or 9th day, are they letting the soil to dry to the point that they're not growing enough grass? So here, back to the irrigation insight plot. So the attribution here is the insight plot that you see on screen here with all the soil moisture conditions, showing the wet and dry conditions a lot better than the last one that you saw. It is also showing how much irrigation is being applied, the blue bars, and the green bars are the rainfall, and the red ones are the evaporation. So what it is all showing is how the soil is responding to the irrigation events and the time between the irrigation events, and what happens when they apply the irrigation, about 20 or 30 or 40 millimeters of irrigation at every one of those events. So the contribution comes here where the farmer is using this plot and trying to answer the questions, am I applying too much water and draining? And is my irrigation frequency really that bad that I'm not able to come back so often to keep irrigating and keeping the soil wet to grow enough grass? I mean, not keeping it optimal to keep the grass growing without stress. So here you can see what the farmer did is they looked at the soil moisture condition at 20 to 40 centimeter depth, and they see the soil is not drying as much as it is drying at the surface. The surface is looking quite dry. You can see the red patch, but not as much at 20 to 40 centimeter. So they are confident that they are growing enough grass. At the same time, they keep varying the irrigations every time when they come there to see what will be the optimal irrigation amount that can be applied without causing a drainage. Now they're doing it, and you can see some of the lateral irrigation events, they drain a bit more than the earlier one. So now they're learning how much they can safely apply without causing a drainage. At the same time, how much they can safely apply, but without drying the soil too much between the irrigation events. So the conclusion in this case the farmer made was they don't need to buy a new irrigator. If they know how to run the irrigator with the amount of irrigation that they apply and the frequency of that irrigation, they can still grow the grass that they have been growing with a new irrigator that could be applying water a lot more efficiently and a lot less and more frequently. So here This is an attribution contribution issue. The attribution here is we showed them the soil moisture plot, the insight plot. The contribution is the farmer taking that information and making use of it to answer the questions that they have without the researcher prompting them. So looking back at that irrigation program, we started with the question of when to start the irrigation. When the regulators got involved, it became when to start the irrigation and stop the irrigation. So originally we gave them the soil moisture at 20 centimeter depth. Then we gave them a 20 and 80 centimeter depth, and we learned things are not working as well as they could. Then we came up with the insight plot, which included all the soil moisture, irrigation, evaporation, rainfall, current condition, and the forecast condition into one plot that is easy to read and visually appealing, and they can make a quick decision based on this one. And through the attribution process that we showed how farmer was using this particular information. So with that one, I'll end the talk, and feel free to send me any questions about this program, and you can see the website where you can go and access this program and a few papers written on this program. So let me know if you need any of these resources. I'm happy to share it with you. Thank you.
We'll hand over to Emmys for some questions shortly, but we'll hand over to Nick in just a moment to give the MB perspective. But just to recap on a couple of points. So what Emmys's project is a really nice example of is about the process. It's about the how. So they had an intention of what their impact was at the start, but they didn't set that intention at the beginning and then just cross their fingers and assume that was going to be what was happening. The process that they went through over the course of the project is actually how they were able to have far more impact than they would have otherwise, because they learned along the way that actually what they thought was not going to deliver the results, the outcomes, and the impacts that they were hoping for. It's a lovely example of how important having a good process in the delivery of your science and research is. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Nick. Welcome, Nick. Nice to see you. First time this year.
It is. Kia ora kara. Thanks for having me as usual. Kia ora koutou, ko Nick Scott toku ingoa. I'm a senior policy advisor here at MB, and I've been doing this Making Sense of Impact seminar for almost a year now. This might be getting close to my 1 year anniversary. Yeah, let me get stuck in. I should warn you that I have a screen up there, so if you see me glancing in that direction, it's not because I'm really shifty. It's just that I caught a glimpse of myself and I was like, I look really suspicious doing that. But, not doing anything suspicious, just checking my slides to see what's coming next. Cool. So as I mentioned, I'm a senior policy advisor at MB. I work in the science policy team. We provide the policy overview for MB's research investments. But I did also used to be a researcher. In fact, relatively recently, I've only been in government for a couple of years now. Before that, I was an academic, mainly in Australia, also the UK. I've also had experience of the German, US, French, South Korean systems a little bit. So I come with a bit of experience, both the sector, how things work in practice, and the sort of government view. And I'm going to try and bridge those two gaps for you today. So some of these things will be MB policy statements, but I'll try and give you a bit of a sense of what does that actually mean for you as well. Just a bit of a history of MB's thinking around impact. Impact really became a key part of what we're looking for out of the science investments in 2015 with this National Statement of Science Investment. You can find that on MB's website if you want to read it. It's quite long, but it's somewhat interesting if you're interested in science policy in particular. As I said, this was published in 2015 and really introduced these two pillars of excellence and impact. However, that impact pillar, it wasn't particularly well defined in that document, and there were a lot of issues of interpretation. Researchers weren't quite clear what MB was looking for. MB wasn't necessarily clear itself what it was looking for. So to clarify that situation, MB began a process of discussion with the sector around the impact of science. This happened in 2017. And it was really designed to clarify those questions of what do we really mean by impact, so people have clarity around assessment criteria and we can support researchers to achieve these goals. This discussion paper introduced the results chain framework, which if you're familiar with iPEN's material, I'm sure you've already seen. And that's real how we frame our thinking about impact. Overall, submitters into that process thought the impact was too difficult to measure directly, but it was actually useful to focus on those intermediate steps, so the pathway to impact rather than the kind of the impact itself. If you're doing research with potential economic benefit, your overall impact is going to be a change in GDP potentially, but you're never going to be able to actually measure that. So what are the things we can focus on, the sort of steps that we can demonstrate that will show that we're on this pathway to having impact? In 2018, a draft RSI strategy was put out for consultation. I should note this was never actually implemented. It fell foul of COVID in essence, but a lot of the thinking in that paper is still valid. One thing I really like about that paper is it proposed this third pillar alongside excellence and impact of connection. And that connection is really important for achieving impact, connecting research results with the real world, and the fact that this relies on relationships and collaboration, and those things are important in themselves, and it's important to resource those, recognize those, have those as key steps in our pathway to impact itself. So you have the excellent research, you have the impact that we want to achieve with that research in the long term, and then one of the ways we achieve that is this pillar of connection.
And Emis's example illustrates that point quite nicely. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah. Finally, following the sort of discussion around the impact of science paper, an impact of research position paper was published, taking into account that kind of consultation. This is definitely available on MBIE's website. Just Google it. It's probably the easiest way. I think iPEN also provide a link to it on their website if you prefer to get things through that. It's a nice short paper, and I would definitely recommend reading the first part of it as well, which really lays out MBIE's thinking around the impact of research. One thing you might note is, as part of the consultation, the paper shifted from the impact of science to the impact of research. It's important to recognize that all areas of research, and MBIE funds quite a broad range of activities there, are likely to yield impact in some form. So I want to emphasize that our role is not just to measure impact and assess the impact of your research, but really to increase the positive impacts of research in New Zealand. And MBIE wants to support you as researchers to both show the benefits of your research and kind of strengthen the impact of that research as well, to your field, to your organization, and to society. So don't think of this as a purely judgment-based process that MBIE runs. We, as an organization, want to see our research have more impact as well, and we recognize that we have a role in supporting you to achieve that. These papers are always a work in progress. We're continuing to refine the concepts in them, how they're applied to our current funding processes and into the future. So we're always keen to hear back from researchers as well. If something's unclear to you, if you think something's a little bit out of date, do get in touch, and there's opportunities to refine these things. So the results chain framework. This slide shows the kind of key figure from that impact of research position paper. One thing I want to emphasize is that although this is represented in a very straightforward and linear fashion, we very much recognize that delivering impact is anything but that. It's complex, there's multiple feedback loops and interconnections, many contributors, and you'll move backwards and forwards between these activities. Really, this is just a set of activities. These are the kinds of things you will need to engage in to demonstrate how your research will have impact, but don't expect them to happen in this order. In particular, starting from the right, MBIE's definition of impact, which is where you really want to focus your proposals, is a change to the economy, society, or environment beyond contribution to skills, knowledge and skills in research organizations. That sort of last part there really emphasizes that is beyond your own organization. So academic impact doesn't count here. It's not how many citations does your research paper get. It is really, are we mobilizing this knowledge? Are we getting it outside the research system into the hands of people who will use this, who will apply this knowledge to make a difference, hopefully a positive difference, though it doesn't actually say that here, change the economy, society, or the environment. Another thing the position paper emphasizes is this idea of line of sight to impact, or perhaps pathway to impact. Basically, that means thinking about the impacts of your work right from the conceptualization stage, which I'm sure you're already doing in some form. And iPEN have a lot of resources to help you do this. We definitely recognize there are many difficulties in demonstrating and attributing impact. The timelines for impact far exceed most funding cycles. The impact of a research project, almost certainly be occurring after your contract is wrapped up. And that's hard, right? Predicting the future is very difficult. So again, it's a really good idea to focus on those earlier stages, the outcomes here, the mechanisms that lead to impacts by use or application of outputs. And that's where we have a bit more control. They're a bit more proximate to the research activity happening, and they're easier to demonstrate. So it's also really valuable to articulate the outcomes in your proposals as well.
And Nick, I was just thinking, sorry, I was just going to say as well, one of the things there, because we know, and this is possibly to address a question that we might get later around then why bother, coming back to that why bother point, but actually if we recognise that measuring that long-term impact is difficult, but what we can do is focus more closely on those shorter-term ones. If you're in a position to actually gather some of that evidence, then that is a really great way for you to, in a next funding round, to say, we can show that we have actually done something impactful, rather than just throwing the baby out with the bathwater, feeling a bit dispirited by the whole thing.
Yeah, and it also recognizes that some of those kind of long-term impacts are not entirely in your control. Perhaps an abstracted example in the health space, if you're doing medical research, you may come up with something that could lead to a change in clinical practice that might eventually get implemented in hospitals and then lead to improvements in life expectancy, reductions in cost of some sort of treatment, for example. But the uptake of that is really up to the Ministry of Health and the health system. You can advocate for it. You can show that you've had meetings with policy professionals in the Ministry of Health, that perhaps you've run training workshops with clinicians, something like that. And that's the kind of the outcome step that's within your control. We're not going to hold you responsible if the Ministry of Health says, oh, that was a really good idea, but actually it's too expensive for us to implement. You won't be punished for that in any sense. So do keep that in mind. Yeah, and that's a nice little segue actually into the idea that impact doesn't just mean commercialization. It's not about can we sell this for money. There's a whole range of different pathways to impact. The health one I talked about, and more generally in public policy avenues. Beyond that, there's community engagement pathways. There's information that supports better decision making. And again, iPEN have done some really good work articulating these different pathways to impact. I really encourage you to think about using that work to frame your own impact cases. So not just how many dollars will this research eventually generate, there are different ways, and articulating those pathways and the steps you will take to start down those pathways is really valuable. I know this stuff can be quite tricky, impact's quite a broad concept, and there's a couple of resources that can really help you frame those discussions. One thing I would recommend looking at is the Treasury's Living Standards framework that categorizes different kinds of impact. It was updated in October 2021, so if you haven't read it for a while, take a look on the Treasury website. And another really good example here that's the Treasury one is on the right-hand side here, and then on the left-hand side is the Heara Waiora framework. This is also from Treasury, but this is their framework for thinking about impact and being from a Māori perspective. This tends to take a little bit more of a holistic approach, as often is the case in Te Ao Māori, and that can again be really valuable as a way of framing your research. I want to emphasize that these are not, you don't choose one of these frameworks or the other, they're not directly comparable. You don't pick the Heara Waiora framework or the Living Standards framework. Both are useful tools and can help you conceptualize the impact that your research will have and say, these will be the long-term outcomes or impacts in this area. It will impact this sort of thing. Just a brief note here, we have had a change of government recently. Those two frameworks are by the public service, not by government. So things may change, but because the Treasury is still using those things to think about the way it frames impact, we may not get another wellbeing budget, but that doesn't mean those frameworks have been replaced, and they're still a good way to conceptualize your research. Cool. I'm going to go fairly quickly through this one because I talked about these things. This just lays out the MB definitions for those different sort of steps along the pathway to impact. I talked about impact already, outcomes being those mechanisms, the stuff that's a bit more in our control. Outputs is really the things you're directly producing from your research. That's journal articles, conference presentations, reports, that kind of thing. Much easier to evidence, but those alone are not evidence of impact. You do need to go beyond that to those outcome steps. And then the pathway is all of these things together. So how all the research activities you're undertaking produce outputs that you'll then use outcomes to connect to important end users of research and eventually lead to that long-term impact.
Yeah. And watch this space for some guidance that iPEN's putting together around different impact pathways. Coming soon.
Oh, exciting.
Oh, whoopsie, sorry, got too excited.
Yeah, so this slide just sets out some of the key actions in the position paper. It's really about what MB is doing to try and help the research community in New Zealand deliver impact, and what we want from you to help research deliver transformative change for all New Zealanders. I won't read it all out loud, but just to highlight a few things. It can help you frame your research proposals and also the sort of outputs of your research in a way that is aligned to MB's thinking around impact. And if we're all on the same page, it's much easier for us to make the assessment of this going to deliver the kind of things we want to fund. As these priorities will likely to be superseded. As I've noted, we've had a change of government. We don't think there'll be a shift away from impact. Perhaps they might have a slight shift in the kinds of impact they're looking to incentivize, and we'll of course keep you folks informed as we learn about that from the new minister ourselves. But definitely impact as a whole not going away, and all of these things will remain an important part of the mix. Yeah, one thing, again, I've said this already, but the key part of our journey together is developing a clear language and framework. So that means you're not having to guess what we might expect from you, and these definitions that I pointed to are really valuable for that. Okay, and I think this might be my final slide. So what to look out for from MB? This is definitely very much in flux. With the change of government, we have a new Minister of Science, Innovation and Technology. You may be aware that Minister Collins has indicated she won't be moving forward the Te Ara Paerangi reforms, but that doesn't mean a complete change in all areas. She still recognises that many of the issues raised through that process are still issues. And as I said before, she is very keen that our research have impact for New Zealanders. So we really don't expect the emphasis there to change.
Yeah.
MB has a number of policy initiatives looking to both increase the impact of research and better support the impactful research that is happening, and also to help you demonstrate that research. One of the things that we've introduced in the last year or so, maybe a little bit longer now, is the use of narrative CVs, for example, that let you tell a broader story about your sort of research career than just, oh, I wrote this many papers and my H-index is this. It really lets you bring in those impact areas. How have you engaged with communities? How have you looked to commercialize your research? Maybe it hasn't quite happened yet, but again, that sort of ability to show the outcome step, the activities you're undertaking, or the outcomes you're enabling as part of your research that puts it on that pathway to impact. And the narrative CV is a really good format for that. They're already using that endeavor. It'll be used in the new fellowships when they launch, and expected to pop up in more and more of sort of MB's research assessment processes. Finally, we recognize that impact doesn't just happen. It needs to be planned for, and it does need to be resourced. One thing we like to emphasize is that in your, again, focusing a little bit more on endeavor, you can ask for money to focus on those impact activities. They're not something we're expecting you to do outside the budget of your own research projects, saying that, no, I need this much money to maintain relationships with the iwi over the course of 5 years is a perfectly reasonable thing to be including that. We know that having impact, and again, pointing to those kind of connections and collaboration functions, doesn't just happen, does need resources to support it, and MB is quite happy for you to put part of the resources of your projects towards those things. We're also looking at other ways we can do this. The previous government announced an applied doctorate scheme, which is designed to strengthen connections between industry and academia, and we expect Minister Collins to continue with a number of initiatives in that area that are really looking to strengthen those connections again. And the new government, we expect to have a really strong focus on promoting knowledge mobilization to accelerate innovation. They really view the research system as a way to grow the economy and deliver wider benefits for all New Zealanders. As I said, that sort of impact lens isn't going away. Some of the language may change a little bit, but you're definitely it's gonna be really valuable to be thinking about that when you're developing your research proposals as well. Oh, I did have one more slide. So what do we want from you at this stage? Your research organizations can support you to plan for and increase the impact of work. IPEN's doing a lot of work in this. Universities are also forming their own networks to support researchers to do this. University of Auckland is probably a good starting point for now, but other universities are strengthening their advice and support here as well. We really want you to use the sort of the results chain framework and language in your documents, and we're also looking to strengthen how they're used in our own guidance. So it's clear that we have this position paper that talks about using it this way, and then when you get to this section of the application, it's really good to be thinking about it there. We're not quite there yet. That's a change we expect to come over the next few years. So you will have to hopefully this kind of seminar will give you the guidance you need at the moment, and then we'll really look to put that into the fund documentation in future rounds. And finally, as I've said, we are continually looking to improve things here, or see if you have feedback on any of this, anything that doesn't make sense to you in the assessment processes, any kind of particular barriers, or if you're unsure whether this kind of activity can be supported out of a research grant, don't hesitate to get in touch with us. So I will hand back to Cara now. But if you have any questions, I guess we've got a few minutes. There are various ways to get in touch with MB and have your questions answered there as well.
That's right. And Nick, your email is in the slides, and there's some links to the documents that you referenced, and we've got another slide which has got these and some others. This is really a chance to open up for a few questions. If anyone has any, you're more than welcome to take yourself off mute and ask your question directly if you'd like to do it that way. But we do have one question in already. You've mentioned that briefly. Is there any details on the applied industry directed funding space available yet? And I think you've said that's still
yes. One of the things that happen when there is a change of government is it does slow down our delivery of initiatives just a little bit. We have to bring the new minister up to speed on things and understand her interest. What I would say is, if you look at the new government's priorities, they're very interested in using the research system to support New Zealand's industries. So every indication we have is they're very keen on the scheme.
Hello, Victoria.
Hi, it was a question for Nick following up on the point around the industry or applied doctoral training. And we're sounding a little bit like broken records when people are saying, isn't that the thing that's happening? And I was wondering if there was any more information.
Not yet, but it is still a thing that's happening.
Okay.
That's all I can really say at this stage.
Yeah.
So okay, thank you.
Okay, please do ask any questions, but just a couple of things to please remember. If we care about impact, really what you need to be doing is focusing on your process, using some of the key tools that we've talked about, but then bringing that into the how you deliver your science. And if you want to understand more about that, of course, there's stuff on the iPEN website. Go and visit the Beyond Results website, get in touch. The other thing too, some of you will know that we deliver some training for CRIs. So this is our training wheel where we walk people through the tools and actually help people learn to use them. So if any of you are interested, we are going to be changing the format of the training. Also, if you're not aware, we have a really great iPEN webinar tomorrow around funding flexibility and how that can support research impact. And that's a really nice connector to the message around the how of these things. How can you actually support impact through the how you do the process? And I think MS could certainly speak to ways in which some flexibility in the way that his particular project was structured really was one of the enablers to some of the impacts that they were able to deliver. And then just to very briefly let you know, I'm just going to flash these up so that you know that they're here. All of the contact details for your various reps is in the slide. So if you need to get in touch with them, you can just zip to the last slide and get them here. And also if you need links to any of our things, including the website. Otherwise, I want to say a really big thank you to everyone for joining us, both to MS and Nick, of course, for coming and giving their time as they do on a semi-regular basis. And just also want to thank those of you who've been able to share some of your takeaways. It's helpful for us to know if we're emphasising the right things when we're pulling this all together for you. So thank you. I'll close with a karakia, but if any of you have any burning questions, you're welcome to stay on the line after this and fire those at us. We'll stick around for a couple of minutes. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te atawhai o te rungarawa, te aroha o tētahi ki tētahi, me ngā manaakitanga o te wā, humie, hui, tai kie. Ka kite everybody, have a lovely rest of your day. Thanks for being here.